Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. In History 102, The New World, it's part 2 of our episode. We'll do genocide, racism, slavery in the New World. I'm going to start with something I've not done before, and it's worth getting into because, so there's a trigger warning. What we're about to talk about is the dehumanization of other people. What we're about to talk about is things that are terrible to discuss and terrible to hear. I am going to have to tell a large percentage of the people here who are listening to this that back in the day, a whole lot of people didn't think they were people. And that has ramifications for us far, far into the future. So be aware that we are talking about terrible stuff from here on in. Though we do end on a bright note, it's a tough lecture to get through, and if you have to take a pause, you have to put it down. If you have to put the lecture in the fridge, you understand. So most important thing is to be safe. So when we left off in our last episode, we were talking about the Portuguese and the Spanish, in order to make money or for sugar in the New World, needed to replace the dead Native American labor with something new. And they couldn't tap into European labor, and Indian and Chinese labor were way too far and way too hard to get. And so what they resorted to is African labor, West Coast African labor. So was this an important industry? Was it a big deal? And the answer is yes. In class, I'm going to show a video called The Atlantic Slave Trade in 2 minutes, it's a video which charts the course of every ship as a dot, and different dots are different sizes because of how big the ships are. And it's going to show just how many ships went from Western Africa to North America, the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, especially Brazil. It was a massive industry. When Britain paid to compensate people for manumission, when in 1833, Britain outlawed the ownership of other people, they outlawed slavery, the solution they had was to take out bonds and to pay those people the loss of their property. They paid the equivalent of 4.25 billion pounds today. That's something like $6.5 to $7 billion today. More important than the slave buying and selling itself, than the slave trade itself, was it fueled every other industry that made money. Europe is going to get rich. Western Europe is going to get rich because of the slave trade, because of all of the industries that had to be built to support it, because of all of the industries that directly use the free labor to profit from it, from all of the education that had to be created. It fueled everything. It is a slave-based economic revolution. Well, why? Well, there's shipbuilding. The first thing that grows in Western Europe is shipbuilding, which itself is a foundational industry. Remember, you need to hire people to cut the wood. You need people, so you need timber. You need barrels for food and water. You need sails, so you need cloth making. You need furnishings. You need furniture to be made so that people can sleep or work on the ship. Far beyond just the ship itself is all the ancillary jobs that go to furnish. Oh, you're going to put cannon on it? Well, now you have metallurgy, a cannon foundry, shot, lead, mining, all of this stuff that shipping created. It is not a surprise that Athens was the richest city in ancient Greece. It also had the biggest navy. It's not a surprise that Britain and the United States are going to be vastly wealthy places and have enormous navies. Shipbuilding is an important industry because of all the things that are required to go into it. Well, if you're going to send a ship out and it sinks, it gets hit by a hurricane, and you lose it, that's a lot of money to be gone. So you need insurance, you need banking, you need loans, you need stock markets. You need a financial revolution to pay for it all. You don't have the money. Nobody has the money to buy 1,000 enslaved peoples on the markets of Africa. They had to get loans to front them the money. Then, well, what if they die along the way before they could be sold in the New World? You need insurance. You need banking to assist on all of this money. You need stock markets so that risk in these companies is lessened. Nobody has the money to buy one giant ship. So what it is everyone buys a piece of it, a percent, 1%, 2%, 3%. They buy stock. They buy bonds. They buy loans. There's the gold and silver being mined. Who are the miners? African slaves. That's straight profit. That gold and silver being mined is straight profit because it's gold and it's silver. It's turned right into coins, right? But that's an immense amount of manpower, of people that you need to hammer away, to pick at a mountain. There's the sugar being grown and other cash crops. Later you'll have tobacco and cotton. Haiti was worth 25% of France's income. Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere today, was worth 25% of France, the richest country in Europe, 25% of its income. That's how much sugar and cash crops were worth. In fact, we start most American history with a lie because we talk about, the Pilgrims came, or in Virginia, the merchants came. And we talk about the coming and settlement by white people of Europe, of the New World. But there were 3 times more enslaved peoples in the Americas than Europeans from 1500 to 1820. The New World was black. Karl Marx said the African slavery trade began modern capitalism. And you can see the shipping, the insurance, the banking, the money, all of that. Remember, we talked about sugar being grown. You had to cut the sugar, you had to mill the sugar, you had to then liquefy the sugar. All of that took money, and it took loans, and it took metal, and it took contractors, and it took an immense revolution. No, people didn't live like this before. So to change how the economy worked, to change how people lived, you needed a revolution, a non-political revolution. But the New World was black. There were 3 times more enslaved peoples in the Americas than Europeans. Why? Because there was nothing really there for Europeans. For the ordinary, you had to own land. You had to own property. Then you had to run that property. You weren't going to work making sugar cane. So you had to buy slaves to do the work. Or you were going to work for someone overseeing that. So you're talking about people who didn't have anything in the old world. Because if I own 20 acres of land, why would I go to Jamaica, where it's heat and the mosquitoes and malaria? And why would I go there, where I'm outnumbered 9-1 by slaves, by enslaved peoples who are not happy with me and be happy to kill me and take my money and take my stuff, right? So for a very long time, there's just, not that many Europeans in the New World. How did the slave trade happen? Well, we kind of already talked about it. The death of Native Americans equaled the labor problem. European conquerors were not going to farm, so they needed a new source of labor who couldn't leave. Now, Africa had old school, think Rome, think Islam, slavery. The idea was you captured people in war, they worked for you, and over a period of time, either they or definitely their children became part of your society. They got absorbed in. So if it's not the slave themselves, it's their children. And so you go off and you fight more peoples and you capture more peoples, and they come in and they work for you for a while, for 5 or 10 or 20 years. They get married, they have children. Those children get absorbed into your kingdom. Even the worker may become part of a citizenry, right? This is a concept that Rome had called manumission. And it was important in Roman and Islamic society that there was this system. Otherwise, they would have, even though you have 30% of the Roman Republic's population is enslaved peoples, you don't have the enslaved peoples overwhelming in a revolution, breaking away, taking over. Right? The most famous of these is Spartacus, because it lasts a little while. It is successful. It defeats a couple Roman legions. It does more than any other slave revolt had ever done. But the way the Romans dealt with that was to make manumission easier and something more people would participate in. You got glory by setting your slaves up as independents. They took on your last name, things like that. You might set them up in business, so you got a percentage of their business. It was a way of making more money. So what happens is the Europeans sail to Africa. And if you're on the video, you can see our little map. It's a game map from Europa Universalis 4. But it shows the different cultures. And there's the blue of the coastal, right? And then there's this light green. There's the brown of these interior pieces. And then there's the light green. And that light green is the Islamic kingdoms we've talked about in 101. Ghana, Mali, Songhai. They are the kingdoms of the Sahel, the empires of the Sahel. They are big, strong, rich kingdoms who are also strong enough to have their own trading networks and to defeat any other peoples who might want to come and take their people. So the slave trade is going to be between Europeans and that coastal people who are blue, right on the coast. Right? They almost are the same color as the ocean and on the map. And they go to those people and they sell them manufactured goods, especially weapons. And the coastal Africans go into the interior, that area that's brown, and capture, make war upon those peoples. Those peoples are not protected by large empires. They're not protected by these large organized cultural states. And thus, towns or small provinces are effectively independent. So then the coastal African kingdoms have a military advantage because they have European weapons, and they wage war on those people of the interior. They capture them, bring them to the coast, and instead of using them as labor for themselves, simply sell them to the Europeans. The effect of this is that the interior part, that brown part, is going to become depopulated from what it was. Some 12 to 15 million people will be extracted from that area. Now, notice the green part, that Islamic part north of it, is capturing their own slaves and selling them to the pink area, which is North Africa, the Berbers and the Arabs of North Africa. Or they're using them for their own labor. But if the blue, the coastal Africans, run into the Islamic Empire Africans, the Islamic Empire Africans win. They have a bigger state. They're more organized. We see this when the Portuguese and the Spanish try to take slaves from India or from China. Is the Mughal Empire and the Ming Dynasty both send an army of tens of thousands of troops and kick the Portuguese and the Spanish out. And so they have to come back and be like, please, 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 just let us trade. We won't capture any more people. We won't enslave any more people. So where you have strong kingdoms, you don't have the slave trade. Or you don't have people being taken by the slave trade. Now what happens is these coastal African kingdoms become dependent on the income of the trade. They're unable to use the enslaved labor in their own industrial, social, or imperial expansion. So these coastal African kingdoms remain coastal African kingdoms. They don't have an industrial revolution. They don't have a financial revolution. They are shipping off the labor they could have used and incorporated to make themselves greater. Instead, they're shipping them off to the Europeans and helping the Europeans make a lot of money. So what justification could Christian Europeans have for enslaving fellow humans? Well, the answer is that they weren't human. That's the way the Europeans are going to look at them. The Africans were not Christian. So we're allowed. The old school rule, going back to Rome, is that all Christians are equal. Christians cannot enslave other Christians. This is a Jewish rule. The Old Testament allows slavery, but not of other Jews, not of other Hebrews. So Christians can have slaves, but not in a Roman world where there was slavery. Yes, you can have slaves, but you can't have another Christian as a slave. So since the Africans were not Christian, we're allowed. Africa had slavery already. And to the Europeans, Africa sucks. It's too hot. There's too many diseases. It's too hard to live. So for Europeans, they thought European slavery was actually improvement. Will be better to you than African kingdoms are. That turns out not to be true. And the New World will be better and healthier for you than Africa was. That turns out also not to be true. So the argument was one, they're not Christians, so we're allowed to do it. There's no prohibition against. And then there's, well, the system already exists, so we're not doing anything new. We're just participating in a system that exists, and we're helping these people get out of a place that sucks. And then there's three. Roman slavery taught us how to do it right. Remember, we have the Renaissance, we have Polybius, we have the Roman writers, we have Aristotle. They have instructions on this stuff. And so the idea is we'll just have Roman slavery, right? We will teach Africans to be European. We will make them Christian, and they will become part of our free citizenry. Done. This will just be the same traditional manner of historical slavery, but it will now be Europeanized, and it will not be multi-generational, and it'll be fine. You know, the idea was slavery could not be multi-generational in Europe, in any of these places. Why? Because if it's multi-generational year after year after year, there's a buildup of anger. Look at how the Helots dealt with the Spartans. When the Helots were finally free, they obliterated Sparta. They didn't say, oh, well, thanks. Thanks, Thebes, for freeing us. Oh, we'll leave the Spartans alone. Bygones. No. They obliterated Sparta. And that's because the Helots could never become Spartan. They were captured people who were kept separate, but in indentured servitude, in slavery, forever, generation after generation after generation. The Spartans could never, because the Spartans were already outnumbered by them. So the idea was, if we marry into the Helots and make them citizens and make them Spartans, there won't be any Spartans. They'll just become Helots. They'll just become Messenians. They'll be absorbed by this larger population. So you had slavery and an ancient version of apartheid as well. And when it ended, the Helots had their revenge. So everybody knows that slavery is a bad system that only works for a short amount of time. It works economically, but the social problems, the political problems, it's too much pressure. And you have to have a demographic method to bring people into your society. Otherwise, your society will implode. So did anyone feel bad about any of this? Enslaving all these other humans? And I know there's like, oh, white people feeling bad, but and I thought about that when I had the question, but did anyone think this was a bad idea? This is totally new for Europe. And the answer is yes, plenty of people. Kind of the most famous is a Spanish priest called Las Casas. He was a priest horrified by the murder of Native Americans, and at first he argued to use black labor to save the natives. But then when he saw how badly the African people were being treated, he argued for universal human rights. So he's one of the early proponents of everyone has a soul. Everyone matters. That there are such a thing as human rights, and they belong to everyone. We have Louis XIV's black codes in the 1660s, which gave protections for enslaved peoples. It did not free them, but it was, we have to treat them better and give them a method of manumission. We have to treat our slaves better than what the English and the Spanish are doing. And so you have all of these protections. I won't go so far as to say enslaved people had rights, but they do gain protections. And as an effect of that, Louisiana had 13% of its black population were free. Meanwhile, right next door, right across the river in Mississippi, less than 1% of the African population, the black population, was free. Third is, you always had African liberation groups in the New World. From the very beginning, slaves ran away, enslaved peoples ran away, African peoples worked with each other, even though they were from different places, speaking different languages. There was always slave revolts. There was always African resistance. We see this in Ecuador and Jamaica and Guyana, where African liberation groups essentially created their own independent freemen kingdoms. They didn't have the technology or the ships to get back to Africa. And as time went on, they became, since they came from all different groups and tribes and areas and provinces, they became something new. They stopped being African and became black and became a new world person of African descent. There was this amalgam of all these different cultures. And so they created, almost from the very beginning, spaces that existed outside of European power. These weren't rich places. They were pretty much out in the middle of nowhere or up mountains or far away. They were in the interior of Jamaica, for example. They were hard to get to, but they did exist. And so from the very beginning, we have the European church, or parts of the European church. We have parts of European governments And even we have Africans as well. So, what was the result? What was the result of the Valladolid debate, which I know I'm saying wrong? Valladolid debate. And we have to talk about what it is for a second. And that is Charles V. He's king of Spain and of Germany because he's a Habsburg, and the Habsburg family was really good at inbreeding in order to smush lands together by marriage. And he is the king of the world. He is the king of Spain and Germany, and he is the king who takes over after Ferdinand and Isabella. He takes over in the age of the conquistadors. And he's worried about his soul because a lot of terrible stuff is happening. And he's worried about his soul. He's a very religious man, and he's worried about his soul. The Protestant Reformation is going to start on his watch in Germany. And so he asks the question, what should we do with the Native American and, by extension, the African peoples under my command, in my empire, in the New World? And he brings together the smartest people of his kingdom. He brings together these leading rights, these leading lights of education, of knowledge, of theology, and they have a debate. It is a debate. It is not, they're not BSing this. It is serious. This is for Charles V's soul, by the way. And Las Casas gets up and says, make them Christian and then treat them as humans like the Bible says. Jesus is watching us. God made all people. God made all people. And just because they haven't learned who Jesus is yet, they should be given the opportunity to learn who Jesus is. They have a right to have their souls saved. Everybody's got a soul, and they have a right to have their souls saved. It's our obligation to treat them as humans. And he sits down. And that is profound. I mean, there's theology there. There's philosophy there. There's just common sense in that. And you go, okay. And then the other side of the debate, De Sepulveda, he gets up and says, yes, sure, I agree with Las Casas. The Bible says all of those things. It says people are equal, people all have a soul, God created all things. It says everything. Chapter and verse, I completely agree with Las Casas. But Mr. King, you get 20% off the top from all economic activity. All the conquests, all the gold mines, all the slave sales, all the sugar sales. If anyone makes any money, you get 20 cents on the dollar. What could you do with that money? So you could either let all these people free and make nothing. No sugar, no sales of slaves, no gold mines, because nobody wants to do this work. It's too hard, it's too hot, it's too miserable. So either you can make nothing, or you can make all this money and build Escorial, the greatest palace in the world. You could save the Catholic Church from the Protestant Reformation. You could defeat France. You could stop the Ottoman invasions. You, Charles, could be the greatest emperor since Charlemagne. That's what you could be. And the answer from Charles V was more. More money, more conquests, more gold, more sales, more sugar. But, and this was a piece that he's giving not so much to Las Casas, but to the Catholic Church, of which he is incredibly aligned with. He is an ally of the Catholic Church. Make him Christian, just to be sure. so that at the end of the day, when he dies and he has to go up to the judgment booth, and he goes to St. Peter in front of the gates of heaven, and St. Peter goes, before I look in the book, what do you have to say for yourself? He can say, I made millions of Christians. I saved millions of souls for Jesus. So now, by doing that, that's a problem, right? Because our first justification, if we went back a couple slides, was they are not Christian. We're allowed to make them slaves because they are not Christian. If we're going to convert them to Christianity, now we have a problem. Because our number one justification is now gone. And in fact, there's the rule. You cannot own a fellow Christian as a slave. You're not allowed. This goes all the way back to the beginning. So then how did Europeans justify maintaining slavery after this debate? And the answer is racism. The answer is racism. If Christians can't own other Christians as slaves, how do you maintain Christian slaves? And the answer is you change the rules of the game. And what they decided to do was their value as humans became tied not to culture, but to skin color. Skin color was seen as natural and unchanging, while culture is flexible, is transitory. You can be Egyptian and become Greek. You could be Greek and become Roman. You have to do is act like a Roman and speak Latin. Boom, you're a Roman. But you can't change your skin color. And so race, or I can't really say race, I have to say color, skin color becomes a new way of separating people. Because here's the thing, in Europe, race is going to continue to have that old school definition, where its culture matters. So the English are a different race than the Welsh, than the Scots, than the French, than the Jews. They were considered different races because they were different cultures. That's the kind of old school, pre-racism, American racism methodology. This is why Whoopi Goldberg got yelled at about her about anti-Semitism, because she got into this fight, and I understood exactly what she was talking about. She's like, Jews are not a race; they are white. And go, that's an American definition, maybe. At best, it's since the 1950s, because when the United States took over the world, or took over half the world, it imposed their definitions of sociology on people. But the Europeans totally considered Jews to be a separate race, so that the Holocaust was racist. From its very core, from its very start, everything about it was racist. But it wasn't tied to skin color, it was tied to culture. But in America, in the Americas, you have the ability to change your culture to white if you can pass as white. So the Irish, the Italians, Jews, Puerto Ricans all become white. And this process is described in a book that we'll talk about later by Nell Painter, a African-American professor at Princeton who has a book called The History of White People, because she discusses this very change. How do the Irish, the Italians, the Jews become white in America? But they're not white. They're not part of the same civilized world back in Europe. How is that possible? So skin color becomes this new way of separating people. And the biggest change is it turns it into multi-generational permanence. That instead of having manumission, where someone could be freed and then become part of the majority society, be assimilated in, now you can't. You will always be separate. There were African people, there were black people in Egypt, in the Greek world, in the Roman world, who were citizens, who were treated as equals. They were exotic, sure, but that was because there weren't a lot of them. But their skin color gave them no negativity. There was no inherent value tied to their skin color. The skin color just was their skin color. They came from a hot place, they were darker. Done. That's the difference between northern and southern Italians. You know, it just wasn't a thing. And now it's a thing. So you will always be black. You can never become Spanish. You could speak Spanish, you could worship the Spanish God, but you could never become Spanish. And we see these fights all the time in Europe today about who is a real citizen. Trevor Noah had a whole thing on a immigrant in France who climbed up a building and saved a couple of white French children and came down. And the reaction was to say, oh, here's your citizenship, now you're French. It's like, wait a minute. He was living in France. He was working in France. He spoke French. He was Christian. He was doing all the French stuff. He wasn't French, but he saved some white babies, and now he's French. Now he's one of you. And Trevor Noah is obviously funnier than I am, but it was the idea that, how does that happen? Well, that's because of skin color. So it's permanent. It's multi-generational. The other thing is that it's obvious by sight. All Europeans are one thing. All black folk are another. And so you see things like in the video, there's the skull sizes, where they're trying to say, oh, black people are more like primates than white people are. That's not true. You can't tell a skull, person's skull, you can't tell a person's race from their skull. But that was in the 19th century. There was in 1906, so this is great-grandpa's day, they took an African male and put him in a zoo in the Bronx Zoo with the park apes. Then with a bow and arrow, the pygmy from the Congo takes to the woods. The keeper frees him at times. Yeah, okay. He's not always kept in a cage. Sometimes he gets to walk around in a bigger cage. That's 1906. Remember, slavery ended 50 years earlier. Racism is still with us. So what is racism's effect on people? And the effect is it separates people by color of skin rather than culture and economics, the traditional way that people were separated. Traditionally, all people within a hierarchy benefited. So all Babylonians, all Greeks, all Romans benefited somewhat from the success of that culture versus other cultures. Not equally. This is not necessarily communism like the nomads had, but you did benefit. There was a reason why the Romans wanted to defeat other peoples. They got their stuff and they all shared in that victory. So we're talking the Greeks, the Romans, Christians, Islamic civilizations. There was a reason you gained support as long as you defeated others. As long as your society maintained itself and things were good, the culture succeeded and you were separated by economics. The rich did the rich stuff, the poor did poor stuff. And you were separated by other peoples by culture. You spoke one language, you spoke Latin, they spoke Greek. Marx and other social economists are going to say that poor folk actually have more in common with each other across cultures. And in fact, rich folk have always intermarried with other rich folks all the time across cultures. So Marx and others are like, wait a minute, what culture is doing is separating people who should be allied, that all poor people have more in common with each other than they do with the rich people who speak the same language as them. So what racism does is allow a minority of rich people to offer the benefits of power to poor people without actually having to share any wealth or power. And this will stop revolutions from changing the system. The idea of this is that someone will say, I may be poor, but at least I'm not X. I'm not this person or that kind of person or I'm definitely better than Y. I'm definitely better than them. I'm definitely better off than them. So I get the privileges. So in the southern United States, poor whites were totally helping to maintain the slave system that it didn't benefit them for the most part. It benefited the rich plantation class who held most of the political power, who held most of the economic power, who dominated the cultural power. But the threat was for these poor people that if slavery ended, the enslaved peoples would then become working farmers, and then they might be better. They might have more money. They might be more impressive. They might rise higher. That the only thing these poor people had, according to Marx and other social economists, is the benefits of race, is white privilege. So that's the kind of what we talk about when we talk about white privilege. It's the idea that your life is still hard. You're poor. You do not have the benefits of middle class or wealth or any of these things. But at the end of the day, you still look in the mirror and say, well, I'm better than those people. That's white privilege. To think of your hard life and say, I'm still better than them. And that's what racism offers. Now, notice that's several hundred years later that Marx is making this argument about racism. So all of this is this cauldron of society, of demography, of philosophy that's being figured out because it's all new. So what did racism invent, and what question did this invention create? What it created was a perpetual servant inferior caste, i.e. black folk. And it created a superior caste, i.e. white folk. Now, the black folk were easy to define. They were people with dark skin. They were black. White folk, well, that's a problem because Europeans did not define themselves as white people. There really weren't any other minorities around. So they defined themselves by culture. So you were English, you were Welsh, you were Scottish, you were Jewish, you were Spanish, you were Portuguese, you were German, but there were 300 different German kingdoms. You were French or Southern French or Northern Italian or Southern Italian, right? You were Greek mainland, you were Greek islands. They're all Europeans, they're all Christians, but they speak different languages, they have different cultures, they eat differently, they take different times of vacation, they have different holidays. So there's no whiteness. So the question is, if racism invents a dual caste system of black folk and white folk, the question is, who gets to be white? And the answer is your participation in which caste is equal to what other caste members allow. You are white because other people say you are white. It's the concept of passing. And so whiteness allows for participation in the benefits of citizenry. The Irish, the Italians, the Jews were not white when they arrived. My grandfather arrived off the boat at 7 years old by himself from Italy and had a lot of names hurled at him. None of which I'm going to talk about. But they were all degenerative. They were all dehumanizing names. The same was true for my Irish ancestors as well. The ancestors of my Jewish friends had the same problems, the same dehumanization when they arrived. They were not welcomed as part of the American citizenry. But after a generation or two, my grandfather fought in the Second World War. They became white. So that while my grandfather, when he was 7, was not white, my grandfather, when he died in the 1990s, was white. My father was white. I am white. I'm Irish, Italian, and German, and Hungarian. I am all kinds of other things. I am a mess of European, right? But in America, I am not any of those things. I am defined as white. How? How did I become that? I didn't pick it. Why, when I get my census form, do I write white instead of Italian? My last name's Italian, right? I'm not Caucasian. I'm not from the Caucasus Mountains. I'm not from southern Russia or Georgia or Azerbaijan or Armenia. I'm not from the Caucasus Mountains. No history of me comes from no DNA comes from the Caucasus Mountains. And yet, why do I pick Caucasian? Well, that's what I'm told to pick. Because somewhere along the way, for racial reasons, Caucasian became the name for white people. Even though almost no white people are descended from the Caucasus Mountains. It's a weird racial thing that goes back to the ancient Greeks. It's just, I just don't have the energy to explain it. It's in 1905, white people be crazy. You just have to understand it. And so white people become Caucasian because in 1905, when it comes to racism, white people just be crazy. But I become white because I am accepted as white. Because when other people see me, they say I am white. They think of me as I'm white. The power structure sees me as white. Right? When I walk down the street, when a cop pulls me over, when I go to vote, everybody else considers me to be white. They don't think I'm Italian. They don't think I'm Irish. They don't think I'm Jewish. They don't think I'm Catholic. They don't think any of those other things. They see me as white. Why? Well, according to Nell Painter's book, History of White People, that's because there's always a black undercast. I am white because I am not black. My heritage is this mess of Europeans, and that's all that's needed. Smush them together, boom, you got white. Why? Because it's not black. That for you to have white people, you need to have an underclass that's black people. And remember, the black people aren't black people. They're Africans from all over Africa. They have different gods and different languages and different customs and different foods and different music and different everything that gets smushed all together. That becomes black. So what happens to the perception of the black body? Well, you live with this every day, right? You see this every day. The black male body is dangerous. It becomes dangerous. Why do cops shoot at a much higher per capita level black people than white people? It's because the perception of the black male body, is dangerous. So it requires violence. Because in the time that we're talking about, till the 1830s to 1860s, there's fear of violent revolt. In fact, it's the 1880s in Brazil. This is the traditional fear of the owner, that they look at enslaved peoples and say, I would never want to be enslaved. So if I was a slave, I would revolt. And so they take that fear and they go, I now have to protect myself against slave violence against me. And so the idea is that black men are stronger, they are tougher, they are more resistant to pain. So white society is justified in using violence and terror to control them. I have pictures in the video that are from Django Unchained. And that is Leonardo DiCaprio as, Mr. Candy? With his hammer that he's going to use to commit violence. Of which he is very pointed. There is a scene in which his character very pointedly says, this is my property. I can do what I want with it. If I want to kill it, I can kill it. They are not people to me. They are my property. They are worth money. And Jamie Foxx and Christoph Waltz just have to sit there because that's the letter of the law. It's immoral and it makes them fume, but it is the letter of the law. So white society is justified to use violence and terror to control black men. And that, my friends, is the story of America. Story of North America. That's why you have a Second Amendment. I mean, you could tell me all about Second Amendment wanted to overthrow the government. No, it didn't. No. The guys who just overthrew a government did not want to arm more people to overthrow them. No. It was to stop black folk from revolting. See, when you start talking about freedom and equality around slaves, they start wanting that. This is why it was illegal in many southern states for black folk to read. Or the parts about freedom and manumission in the Bible were taken out. You don't want them to have the idea that they could ever be free. But if you're going to stop a slave revolt, you're going to need guns, is the idea. You also need to keep your white women away, segregated from black men. And this is going to be true in the United States till 1967. Now, white men can have sex with black women. And we're going to have a long discussion about that in a little bit. But white women must be segregated from black men. Well, the first part is that black men are dangerous and violent. And so there's the protection of white women's sexuality. But there's also tied to that the fear that white women, if given the choice, might just prefer black men. See To Kill a Mockingbird. See the trial scene in To Kill a Mockingbird. And what this does is justifies the white male control over white women's bodies and violence against black men. And we see this in the United States in lynching. Now, lynching is not just against black men. It also involves Hispanic men, Mexican men. The first lynching after the Civil War or in the 20th century is of a Jewish man. So it's not just one type of public violence where the male society takes it upon themselves as a vigilante group to murder another person who violates some kind of code. But overwhelmingly, lynching was tied to sexuality, to the threat, to the belief, to the question that black men were getting out of their lane in relationship to white women. And so lynching was an act of terrorism. This is why it's public. To all other black men, stay away from our women. But it also justified white male control over their wives and their daughters, who their wives and daughters could talk to, who their wives and daughters could have relationships with, who their wives and daughters could interact with, and how. The black female body, on the other hand, became exotic, magical, seductive. It's not dangerous. It's something that can't be resisted. And so there is constant. We have Sheba from Django Unchained. He gave her the name Sheba from the Queen of Sheba, the sexiest woman who comes to the sexy queen who comes to Solomon and throws down with Solomon saying, "Hey, I heard you're the smartest man in the world. Show me what you got." Like, that is an interesting choice of a name, and look at how she's dressed. Right? She's drinking alcohol. She is a sexually available woman to the white owner. And so what you have is constant sexual violence to violate women, to humiliate black men, and to control the black family, either through pregnancy or sale. So a black woman's child is either half white, is mixed race, half white, and thus not black, not totally black, or is still subject to sale, to dispersion, to be, if you get out of line, I will make sure you never see your child again. So the black female body becomes a thing to be possessed by white men. And constant sexual violence is part of that. That brings us to Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, which is the most famous interracial relationship of this pre-revolutionary period or early revolutionary period of this time period we're talking about. And so thus, because it's the most famous, I feel like we got to talk about it, or I have to bring it up. There are facts, and here are the facts, and these facts are undisputed. Okay? So this first part I'm talking to you are facts and undisputed facts, even from the Jefferson family, Monticello.org, the national park that runs the Jefferson estate. Facts. Hemings was Jefferson's sister-in-law and 75% white, quote unquote, by ancestry. Hemings' father, Sally Hemings' father, was the same father of Jefferson's wife. Okay, so Jefferson married a woman whose father, his father-in-law, had a sexual relationship with a slave woman who gave birth to Sally Hemings. Okay, so Hemings is Jefferson's sister-in-law. He fathered her 6 children. When they started their relationship, he was 44 and she was 14. While in France, she was technically free. During the French Revolution, France got rid of slavery, and so that applied to all diplomats as well. So she was technically free, and he paid her $2 a day or a month. Whatever it was, whether it was a day or a month, it was 1/4 of what the French servants got, who got $8 to $12. He never emancipated Miss Hemings, but in his will freed all of the children and 5 of her male relatives. Some had already, quote, run away, but they weren't pursued and or they were actually given money to leave. So they are technically runaways, but there is a bit of a wink and a nod to at least some of them, including her eldest daughters. He never mentions her by name in any of his diaries, and this is a man who wrote everything. This is a man who probably wrote 1 million lines of words and never mentions her once. Problems. Okay, so those were facts. Now we're into problems. Their relationship says more about other people and other times than themselves. We actually don't know much about them. And so there's a novel in 1979 by Barbara Chase Rebhold, which is Sally Hemings was not raped. There was the need in 1979 in the post-civil rights era in second-wave feminism to empower a black woman, to give her her denied dignity. She was not the plaything of a white man. She wasn't raped. She, in fact, had a relationship, a consensual relationship, and helped change American history through Jefferson. She was a consenting partner in that relationship. She returned from Paris. She didn't have to come back. She could have stayed in France. She was a free woman in France. So she came back willingly. And so the idea was, in this novel, that they had a not equal, never equal, because she's also a woman, she's also black, but a consensual relationship in which she was a partner in it. There's also the movie in 2000 with Sam Neill, who was from Jurassic Park. And this one's different. It's called Sally Hemings, An American Love Story, bound by slavery, but freed by love. Well, she was never freed, right? She was never emancipated. So he didn't free her to take her as his wife in a legally binding relationship. He never did that. So that freed by love. So, interestingly also, and this is important, the Sally Hemings novel has Monticello as its building in the background, while the movie has this weird grass that leads to what looks like the modern White House. So the movie in 2000 was the need for white America to justify an American hero. See, in the late 90s, it came out that it was proven. It had been rumors for a while. You get the 1979 novel, for example, but it was proven by DNA testing that Jefferson was the father of several of Sally Hemings' children. And so by 2000, it was no longer acceptable to say that didn't happen. It was science. It did. He had sex with this woman and was the father of her children. He also did not emancipate them in his lifetime, nor did he ever emancipate Sally Hemings. So there's problems there. And so the movie is this chance to whitewash, to justify an American hero. It's forbidden love. They were partners in his greatness. It's not Jefferson's fault. It was America. America was just too racist to accept that they loved each other. Now, that sounds similar to, but there's an important difference with the novel. The novel is about empowering Sally Hemings. It's about empowering a black woman in the late 70s. It's an attempt to give her dignity that has been denied. Because Sally Hemings was not a major figure in Jefferson's story at all. Now she is. But she wasn't at the time. And this was a chance, because of civil rights, because of second-wave feminism, to reclaim some dignity. That's not the movie. The movie in 2000 is trying to make it okay what Jefferson did. Now, here's the thing. We are in 2023. By our definitions of consent, of power, Thomas Jefferson is a rapist. Thomas Jefferson had sex with a woman who could not say no, who was in no position to say no. Had she said no, there would be consequences, or she would be afraid of consequences. Could he sell her children away? Yes. They might be half him. Didn't matter. They weren't white. They weren't considered white. They weren't accepted as white. So he could have sold them. Could he force himself on her by violence? Yes. Could he torture, punish her? Yes. She was his property. She was not human. And so, by our definitions of 2023, of our hashtag Me Too and our hashtag Black Lives Matter and our new understandings of date rape, which was just beginning in 2000 of what rape could be, the traditional definition I grew up with when I was a kid was physical violence, a stranger. We now know that rape is much more common in nonviolence and by somebody you know. So we have a different definition in 2023. And by that definition, Jefferson's a rapist. And a lot of people don't like to hear that, which is why they yell at historians and say, don't teach this kind of stuff. Don't say it. We'll get rid of the books. We will burn the books. We'll get the books out of the classroom. Okay, but he still did it. It's Galileo. It still moved. The earth still moves. Jefferson still fathered her children, and she couldn't say no. And that's why being a historian at times sucks, because you get yelled at a lot. No one does this in math, and we'll talk about that. But we kill our heroes. Yes, this is the man. This is the man. And this is the important part of all of this, is that this is a man who wrote a declaration, and he handed it to Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin read it, and he handed it to John Adams, and John Adams read it. And they both said, damn, man, that's awesome. All men are created equal. That is awesome. That is right out of John Locke. You did it great. You nailed it. We're going to go show it to Hancock, and we're going to, by July 4th, we're going to pass this. So we got some time. Take a vacation. You could go in Philly, run on Market Street, to the place where he wrote these words. We have kept it. It is still there. A few blocks away from Independence Hall. And he wrote, all men are created equal. And then he took a vacation. And he went down south. And he went home to Charlottesville. And he knocked on her door and said, 9 p.m., come up and see me. Now, maybe that feeling was excitement that she had. Maybe when they came and he was in his carriage on his way and they saw him down the road coming out of the town, people definitely came, other enslaved peoples definitely came up to her and said, Master's coming. Jefferson's coming. What feeling did she have? I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows. But he did it. He wrote, all men are created equal. And then he went home and treated people unequally. And that's hard to talk about. Man, it's hard to say. So that's the start of America. That's the contradiction of America. That's why we are where we are. with George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter, and we just had another one, Tyree, and we had um, little boy Rice, Tamir Rice, and again and again and again, America was founded on that violent contradiction that a man who could say all men are created equal then didn't live that in his own life. He didn't go home and say, "You're all equal to me. You are valuable." No. He went home and said, "You are my property. You are my wealth." You are a machine. And if that machine gives me pleasure, then that's good. But if it doesn't give me pleasure, well, I'll get rid of it and replace it with another machine. See, we hear about Sally Hemings. You think she was the only one? Really? You think when she was 6, 7, 8 months pregnant, 6 times, that he suddenly went, I'll be chaste. I don't need sex. I'm done. I'll wait. Really? You really think that? We don't know the other ones. And even this one, even Sally Hemings, we forgot about. It was just kept alive and by the family, by her family, by her children. It was kept alive until technology caught up. But how many others? So what happened to African culture in the Americas? This is our positive. If the last 2 slides were terrible, this is our positive. African culture in America is a triumph against every obstacle. Despite being from innumerable groups who spoke different languages, had different cultures, had different values, had different gods, didn't even like each other. In the crucible, in the furnace that was the awfulness of slavery, of which the average slave lived only 3 years in America. If you were lucky, you got 3 years. That's how hard they were worked. That's how much violence was committed against them. Despite all of that, they created a new black culture in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in North America. A black church. Catholic in some places, Protestant in others, but definitely different from the European church. Black food, black versions of European languages. When I was a kid, there was the movie Airplane. And there's a scene in Airplane where they're asking the passengers what did they eat because they want to know who got sick on what food. There's food poisoning on the plane. And the flight attendants go to these African American men and they ask them, "Well, what did you eat?" And they respond in a slang that she doesn't understand at all. And this little old lady goes, "Oh, a stewardess, I speak jive." And then you have the African American men who are in their 30s or 40s speaking to this little old lady, speak a jive. And that was hilarious to us in 1982. Oh, but that's the idea, is that you see this, you deal with this all the time. I say homeboy, and I'm an old white man. But that's the best way I know to describe the relationships between a lot of these different peoples. It's Alexander and his homeboys. That's who they are, right? But that's a language comes from black language, black English. There's black music. Now in America, we'll get jazz and the blues, right? Rhythm and blues. But in the Caribbean and Brazil, you get reggae. You get samba. Those aren't European in any way, shape, or form. They are black. They are African. So, despite violence and destruction and death and misery and perpetual servitude, black identity becomes dominant in the Caribbean and Brazil, where over 85% of all slaves went. It influenced and integrated with the cultures of North America, where 5% of slaves went. It made European culture blacker despite the racism. See, the thing is that for all the argument against people, their skin color made them worse, their culture is absorbed in. So that the United States is an incredibly black culture with black food. Like, I don't get the racists. I just don't get them who say, oh, what are you going to have? Watermelon and fried chicken? I mean, who doesn't love watermelon and fried chicken? Oh, you're going to have your cornbread with sugar? Well, who doesn't love cornbread with sugar? Like, cornbread with sugar is awesome. Are you kidding me? Why would you want it without sugar? It's missing the sugar part. Right? I don't understand that. Because fried chicken's good. Watermelon is good. Like, how is that bad? And why are you so racist that you can't enjoy fried chicken? Popeyes is good, right? But notice how it's sold. It's sold by Popeyes, right, to white people. It's sold by Kentucky Fried Chicken. A white guy, an old white guy, is saying it's okay for white people to enjoy fried chicken, right? So despite all the racism, despite all the violence, despite all the destruction, African culture, black culture in the Americas is a triumph, is nothing but a triumph. From dance to language to music to food, it is a triumph against every obstacle. So that's where I'm going to end. I'm going to end on, despite everything we live through on a daily basis, there's this victory of culture. And while in the Americas or in the Caribbean, the language will be English, the language will be French, the language will be Spanish, it'll be a European institution. That institution is made their own. The Black Baptist Church is different from my Catholic church or from a white Baptist church. It's different. The hymns, the singing. We see this, if I have a chance in the episode, in the class, I'll show The Simpsons, where the Simpsons go to white Protestant church. There's a saying that 10 a.m. on a Sunday, America is the most segregated during the entire week. The most segregated time in America is 10 a.m. on a Sunday because black people go to black church, which is almost all black people, and white people go to a white church, which is almost all white people. And The Simpsons, they have this episode where Maggie is sick and they're at the white Christian church. They're at the Christian church, and Marge asked the priest, the minister, where's Dr. Hibbert? Do you know where he is? And the priest goes, well, he's at the more boisterous church down the road. And they walk in, smash cut. They walk in, and boom, and it's singing, and it's hymns, and it's dancing, and it's all this joy. The drums are going at 118 beats a minute, and it's just joy. And Bart says, black God rules. That the black church is just more fun than the white church is. And that comes out of, that joy, that effervescence comes out of horror and trauma. And so the culture is of triumph that has affected everybody. And it has affected world culture. The world is just in 2023 is just blacker than it was before this integration, before mass communication, before all of the inventions, but also before all of this movement, diaspora of people too. So be safe, take care. Thank you for listening, and I'm sorry.